Nous présentons aujourd'hui pour un avenir plus vert. Imaginez la transition vers des villes durables au Canada, animée par Dr. Daina Mazutis. Daina est l'une de nos diplômées Telfer de notre programme MBA 2004. Elle est professeure agrégée titulaire en stratégie à l'Université d'Ottawa, où elle est également titulaire d'une chaire de doctorat en éthique, responsabilité et durabilité. Most recently, Daina is examining the built environment's role in sustainable urban development. This research is supported by grants from SSHRC, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada.
Merci, Roxane, and welcome to everybody this afternoon. So thanks again for joining us for this first masterclass that we're hosting to launch the new Telfer campaign in greening. So without further ado, this first part is really about setting up why are we here? Why are we talking about cities, and why is this so important? So clearly, as you've all have read in the news, we were experiencing, of course, unprecedented population growth, and most of this is happening in urban areas. So we're going to hit about 10 million people by the year 2050, and we have to put them somewhere. And so this is an enormous amount of people to house, and they're expecting that this global floor area that we're going to need to build is going to be more than we've ever built before, and it's roughly the equivalent of adding the city of Paris to the globe every week for the next sort of 40 years. And when you think about that magnitude and scope of just the built environment that has to be constructed, you could see how important the built environment sector becomes to a more sustainable future. So why are buildings so important? Because they are one of the largest sort of culprits of global warming. And so buildings themselves represent sort of 39% of all carbon emissions, 33% of all waste, and the waste doesn't get recycled. And it's just, it's a very long and protracted kind of life cycle. So when you construct a building, it stays around for 50, 75, 100 years. In Europe, even longer, 300, 400 years, the old buildings, right? And so we've got to think of not just the operations. And I think often when we think about built environment, we think about how can we reduce our energy output of our buildings or increase our energy efficiency. We think about the operating part of a building. But really, we've got to think about it through the whole life cycle, right? Everything from the extraction of raw materials all the way to like what happens to the building when it actually has ended of its useful life. What do we do with it then? So reimagining what these, even in Ottawa, these extra 500,000 people, where are they going to be living? What is it going to look like? Has important decisions that have to be made sort of today. And so it's really a very topical area to study. And so how do we go from this, which is kind of what is happening in a lot of the places where urban planning is not being done in a very sort of systemic and conscious way towards a more sustainable future, to something that looks more, I don't want to use the word utopian, but it is a little bit idealistic. So I want to spend this afternoon with you kind of thinking about what could it look like, imagining the future, sort of more electric, more renewable energies, less carbon, less fossil fuels, all that sort of stuff. So I'd like to introduce our panel, and so we have three people in the industry right now that are working in this space, and are delighted to have them with us here today. We'll start with Jonathan Westeinde. So I already talked a little bit about ZB in the introduction as a sort of an inspiration for the kind of research that I do. And so Jonathan is the CEO and founder of the Windmill Development Group that started that project, but is also now moving on to lots of more and interesting different projects. So, and then we'll be followed by Helen Goodland, who's joining us from out of British Columbia there, where she is the head of research and innovation at SCIUS Advisory, and they do a lot of work also on sustainable buildings and sustainable construction, and moving that whole industry sort of from a very analog world to a more digital world. And lastly, I'll ask Mike Moffatt, who's right here, our colleague at the Smart Prosperity Institute at the University of Ottawa. They've recently done a lot of work specifically on the construction and built environment sector, and recommendations for policy in terms of how we really need to pay attention to this sector.
Sure. Great, thanks. Happy to be here. So I founded the Windmill Development Group in 2003 with the goal of sort of, I came from a family construction business, but wasn't that involved in the business, was more in high tech and venture capital, and really saw the merging of innovation and sustainability in the built environment in 2003. So founded Windmill with the idea of being leaders in the sustainable built environment as a real estate development firm.
So thank you for that. And so I'll turn the floor over to Helen.
I've been around the green building game for many years. I guess goes back to starting Lighthouse Sustainable Building Centre back in 2004. So when Jonathan was doing all the great work out in Victoria, we were sitting in Vancouver thinking, that's fantastic. We need to somehow amplify all of this information and get it out to industry. So SCIUS is a relatively new organization, and this is really bringing together our company brings together a full cross-disciplinary perspective to the real estate and construction sector. So I'm an architect by training, and I have an MBA. So I sort of inhabit this interesting world between the sort of the business rationale and the kind of the guts of building and designing and putting buildings together.
And we'll turn the floor over to Mike Moffatt.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. So Smart Prosperity Institute is housed at the University of Ottawa. We have a policy shop that I run. So the policy shop is a think tank where we have 20, I think we're 20 or 21 researchers, all looking at a variety of clean growth topics, this being one of them.
Thank you very much. So there have been some great questions in the chat, and so I think what I'll do is I'll just read them out and maybe point to the first folks who might want to tackle that. It seems that there's a lot of great work for creating new buildings and spaces, but is there a solid economic and infrastructure strategy to address existing building stock? I'm going to answer your second question. I don't think the solution is just to knock them down and build new, but I'll leave that question also perhaps for Jonathan or Helen. Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in to start. Yeah, so totally agree with the statement in the sense that we could build every new building we want to, the best building possible, but it's going to really have a small dent unless we really figure out the existing building stock. We have also had a joint venture over the years with a company called Ledcor, the third largest contractor in Canada, called Ledcor Renew, which is focused specifically on renewing and updating existing buildings. So yes, on Zibi, there's some of those older buildings that we were restoring. Those unfortunately became more just the shells and doing the rest. But really, when we start looking at more of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s buildings and restoring those, we've had this business running for a while. We've successfully only done a full update and retrofit of 2. And the challenge, there's the intent there, but again, the challenge is got so much to do with existing occupancies and when occupancies are going to change, and how can you get in there and sort of do a wholesale retrofit and a myriad of things that to date anyways make it very hard to take a systematic approach to existing buildings. Again, on paper and policy you can sort of say go to this, but we deal with a very, very fragmented industry, very fragmented ownership groups, very different sort of motivations, all these sorts of things. And so it's certainly one of my passions. It's certainly something with our One Planet Living Fund. We've allocated some funds to put towards that, but there is I just say from a practical implementation point of view, still so many barriers in the way of just really being able to go at it. And it's unfortunate, but it's almost easier to look at a piece of land and say we can build the best, most environmentally friendly building here easier, even though it's got lots and lots of struggles dealing with city and all, than often tackling an existing building, which is a head scratcher, but that's sort of the situation at the moment.
Helen, I'm wondering if you could tackle that one, and also the next question that came up, which is related, right? Which is on this topic of buildings and the materials, like what's being done in Canada to ensure the circularity of materials. So there's both the retrofitting issue, but there's also when you are building and retrofitting, how do you have that required infrastructure to support that circularity? That question comes from Walter Yeager.
Yeah, it's so interesting, this conversation about circularity, because, like last year, it was nowhere. Like the language and the vocabulary around, the building life cycle really was focused on, the embodied impacts of materials and choosing the right materials up front to try to reduce, the sort of the impacts from the production. A lot of the products that go into buildings are very energy intensive to produce, or have a very, significant climate footprint. So yeah, this is like, this is the gnarly problem that we've been wrestling with for decades. And it's still, as Jonathan mentions, it's very messy. Out here in BC, in Vancouver, the land prices are so high, it's really hard to make a financial business case for, renovating a building. You're much better off to knock it down, add another 10 stories to it, and, you can, you make your money that way. So I think strong policy leadership is going to be the way forward for that. I mean, I come from the UK where, real estate is much more at a premium. It's much more, there is a business case for retrofit and to renovate and restore and refurbish the buildings that you've got. In Canada, where land is, we're so blessed with so much space, it's very hard to make the case that you want to actually fix up the buildings that you've got. But one of the things that we've started to see, and we've just finished actually working with the Delphi group, ecosystem map of Canada's capacity around circularity, and where are we at with starting to embed principles of circular economy in the construction industry. And I want to stress that we're really at the very, very start of this. But there is stuff going on. I think there's cause for hope. The language is getting out there into the industry. And one of the things that we've seen that has become quite an interesting point of conversation is this emergence of mass timber and timber prefabricated systems, because it lends itself not only to a very efficient way to construct, but it's also, you can start to deploy things like mechanical fixings. You don't have to use tons and tons of glue. You don't have to, people do, but you don't have to use the types of products that once you've assembled them together, it's really difficult to deassemble them again and find them and put them back into their constituent parts. So I think the conversation has started. We did see that right across the country, there is some really interesting things going on. There's a program out here in BC called Reframed that the Pembina Institute has got started, which is really looking at what's the value proposition of deep retrofits. There's a program from Europe called Energy Sprong, which basically takes 3D laser scanning and can scan existing buildings, and you can design and deploy new layers of insulation, better windows, heat pumps and solar panels in sort of like a week. You can upgrade a 2-story house or a terrace of houses or a row house. So there's sort of really interesting things starting to happen, but it's awfully early still, unfortunately.
That's still great examples there. So that's always fun. I think that those are the inspirational ones. I realize there's lots and lots of challenges, but when you see somebody able to break through and actually change something, I think it's always very exciting. So we'll move over to the next one then, which is about the success examples for construction companies and other stakeholders pressuring cities to change building codes that we might be able to look at for some inspiration. So that comes from Monique Lefebvre. And I don't know, Monique, if you were trying to get to specifically lobby groups that have been pressuring government. So there have been examples in the case studies that I mentioned from our research study where, for example, very successfully in London, again, in the UK, the municipality of Sutton, they've got a lot of associations, industry associations that have been able to lobby the government for more stricter regulations, rules and regulations. So there are examples of that in the construction industry elsewhere in terms of energy efficiencies and things like that. I don't know if anybody else wanted to comment on that particular question, or we can move on to commuting, a question for Mike.
Yeah, no, I like to comment on that one. Oftentimes the technology and the business practices change faster than government's ability to react to it. My favorite example in this space is when Airbnb started to become a thing. It wasn't even clear, what provincial regulation it would fall under. And, when you look at it, you go, okay, well, it's probably, it falls under the sort of hotel regulations. Well, in Ontario, the hotel regulations, first of all, it's called the Innkeepers Act. And the Innkeepers Act, at the time that they're putting in Airbnb, has a clause in it that, when a customer doesn't pay their bill, how long does the innkeeper have to wait till taking possession of that guest's horse? That gives you an idea of how quickly things move. So it's a tough sort of balance, but at the same time, we can think that, okay, well, we want government to be more agile, change rules. But then also, if you talk to business, and ask them, okay, well, what do you need? one of the first things that businesses will say is, well, we want regulatory certainty. So it's like, on the one hand, we want to change the rules all the time to allow for new business practices and technology, but at the same time, businesses want, you know, some sort of stability and certainty about what the rules are so they can long run plan. So it's a very tough tension. Plus the fact that oftentimes, you know, government doesn't have the expertise, whether in things like circular economy or other areas. So there's just these competing tensions for government, for the need to create regulatory certainty, but also the need to, you know, update rules and regulations with the changes in technologies and business practices. So it's a tough problem. Governments have to sort of walk that fine balance, and you don't want to be updating things too frequently, but at the same time, technology and business practices often get ahead of the regulations.
There is one point, sorry, just to be clear about the construction and real estate world. I mean, you know, it represents a workforce that is larger than the 3 second largest companies, its sectors combined, and yet we've never had a single point of contact for the industry at the federal or provincial governments. Like, if you are lobbying for changes to building regulations, you have to, or changes to the construction industry, you have to go to like 10 different departments in BC, we've counted them all up, who've got a finger in the construction pie, and you guys are in Ottawa. It's like, it's insane that there is no minister for construction. You've got infrastructure, you've got housing, you've got finance, you've got legal. Why isn't there one person that the industry can go to get this sorted out?
But it goes both ways, I'd say, because I'm always frustrated on the other end is not only there's not one person you can go to, but the 10 people you can get 100 people from the industry from various different sources, you know, so there's no voice there. It's you know, again, it suffers from a lot of fragmentation and the inability to kind of get to universality. But the other thing I would say that I always bemoan when dealing with different levels of government when the building sector goes is that, you know, Mike, exactly as you said, technology is often moving faster than policy. We're in an industry that has the lowest R&D spending of any, you know, major industrial sector, and there's no notion of piloting or R&D lab. You know, so even in developing some of this, and you know, this is what we've been able to do when we did Zibi and things like that. We're able to say, okay, let's try an example where we break the rule. We don't have to do a wide sweeping policy change and wait for everything to catch up. You know, let's try it, learn from it, and help that inform, you know, where we go with policy. Because that cycle, which you might see in normal tech and innovation, just doesn't exist in the building environment. It's sort of just, it's one step to another step. And by the time you get to that step, it's outdated and it's always catching up.
So there's a question there about commutes. And of course, what does that do about housing and affordability, right? So when you do have a long commute, in some cases it's necessary because you just can't afford anything in the big city. And so what do we do about that? We've got some comments about some great companies that are doing some stuff, but maybe some more examples about creative solutions. Is it legislation that's the solution? Is it investment that's the solution? And then maybe another question at the end about developing international standards and how do we get to that kind of level and closing the loop there.
Sure. Well, I can talk about the commute one because this is some of the research that we've been doing. You know, back in 2015, 2016, the population of Ontario started to grow substantially. Our population started increasing partly due to immigration, but mostly due to an increase in non-permanent residents. So this is international workers, international students, and so on. And what we saw was that, you know, Toronto got even more expensive. Toronto's always been kind of expensive. And we saw that young families started to not be able to afford this, which had happened for a while, but started escalating. So those families they'd have a kid and they'd move to Milton. And then Milton got expensive, so they moved to Hamilton. Then Hamilton got expensive, they moved to Brantford. Brantford got expensive, they moved to Tillsonburg. Tillsonburg, which is a Stompin' Tom song, is one of the fastest growing real estate markets in Canada, right? And we could actually see this, that these high prices of real estate propagate like a wave. And you can actually see it in the timing of when each of these communities started to receive, you know, get higher real estate prices. You know, the further away you get from the CN Tower, the later the higher the real estate prices going up. And this is an issue. And I think the only way that we're going to solve this is to figure out how to densify our cities, particularly Toronto, Mississauga, Brampton. Ottawa's a little bit different just because of sort of geography of the place. But in short, yes, we're going to need density. And again, when it comes to this sort of urban boundary that we're finding over the last 5 or 6 years, that we're not sort of containing growth, we're just moving it down to 401 and 403 and so on. So trying to figure out how we can get a population that's growing. There's a whole new initiative now out of the C.D. Howe Institute and others. It's called the Century Initiative, which is how to get 100 million people living in Canada by 2100. If we're even remotely close to that goal, we're gonna have some tough decisions to make. If you look at their forecast, for the Century Initiative, they're looking at 35 million Canadians in the GTA by 2100. That was the population of Canada about 10 years ago. Now, in the next 80 years, we're gonna take all of Canada and compress it into about a 60-kilometer radius around the CN Tower. That's going to take some really creative thinking over the next 80 years.
Yeah, those are some sobering statistics. Thanks for that. So again, I want to thank my panelists, Jonathan, Mike, and Helen. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We encourage you to continue this conversation, right? So my research area is in this field, and I will be continuing on it for the next foreseeable future. And so please let us know if you have any comments or feedback. Otherwise, we will end the session just with a big thank you. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde. S'il y a aussi des questions, quelque chose comme ça, vous pouvez toujours se suivre avec nous, avec les liens qui sont disponibles sur l'Internet. Alors, merci beaucoup à tous et à toutes. Bonne soirée.